Hey there, in this video, I am going to walk you through how to make our latest and greatest brand new block number 23. So block number 23 features a quarter circle curve. And if you're intimidated by curves, don't worry. I've broken it down into 3 manageable steps. So as we go through this video, I'll be showing you how to make your first test block of block 23 in 3 parts. So our first part is we are going to cut our fabric. The second part is we are going to pin and sew. And then the last part is trimming. So personally, I found piecing curves to be really intimidating, but I am really excited about this 3-step approach to piecing this block. So watch this demo video and then I am sure you will feel more confident about piecing these curves. All right, so jumping into our first step to make block 23. Our first step is cutting our fabric using the cutting templates. All right, so before I get started with this part of the demo, I want to walk you through what's on my table. So I have the instructions for making block number 23. Right now, I'm working on my test blocks for the Aurora Block of the Month program. Of course, I've got my fabric and I've got my cutting templates here, and I've got my cutting board, and I've got some marking tools here. I've got a variety here. I've got my scissors, my rotary cutter, and then I've got a couple of rulers. I don't think I'm going to use the rulers, but I just wanted to have them all out here. And that is what is on my table. So let's get started with cutting. Before you cut out your cutting templates, I want you to make sure that your 1-inch test square on your cutting template is actually 1 inch, right? So take your ruler and just measure that to make sure that it measures 1 inch on both sides. Excuse me, it's got to make sure it measures 1 inch. And I've already done this with my cutting templates I've cut out already. So we're good to go there. For your cutting, you will be instructed to cut out some squares for this cutting template here. So smaller squares here, and then you'll be instructed to cut triangles like this magenta triangle, and this triangle will be cut like this using this cutting template. That's it in a nutshell. So let's get started cutting this part here. So for your test block, you can just cut 1 layer. So let's just cut 1 layer. And it doesn't matter whether you cut from the right side or the wrong side of the fabric. So what you're going to do in a nutshell is you're going to lay your cutting template on top of your fabric. You're going to use one of your fabric marking tools and you're going to mark this curve here. And then you're going to cut with your fabric scissors. So let's mark from the wrong side of the fabric just so you can see it. All right, so we're gonna lay our fabric down, and normally I would mark with washable markers, but for the purposes of this demonstration, I'm gonna use my Sharpie so you can see it nice and brightly on the camera. So I am just gonna line everything up. I've got my straight edges of my template on the straight edges of the square, and we are just going to mark this. And as you're marking, do try not to stretch the bias edge here. All right. And then you are going to take your fabric cutting scissors and just cut along that line. All right, we are good to go here. And then the last thing you want to think about is you might want to mark your fabric with these matching points here. So on the template, I've got some stars here. And when we go to sew these, you are going to want to match these points to the points on the other part of the fabric. At this point, I can eyeball it. So if you are new to curves, you might just want to transfer that. And when I first started sewing curves, I used to have a pinhole hole maker, and I would put pinholes through my templates and then I would stick the marker through that so I'd be able to mark it. So I'm just going to eyeball it here. And here. There we go. So I just put 2 dots where those matching points are going to be. All right, so I've got one part cut out, and let's cut out the next part. So we're going to repeat the process. I'm going to put my fabric right side down so you can really see. Since these shapes are symmetrical, it doesn't matter. All right, so I've lined up this edge with the edge of the triangle here, and I am going to use my marker. So normally I would use a washable marker, but because I want you to see what I'm doing, I am going to use my Sharpie and mark that curve here, doing my best not to stretch that bias edge. And then grab, while I'm here, I'm going to put those matching points. So there's one, and then, so I'm putting my fingernail where that matching point star is. There we go. All right, and then my last step here is to cut along that curve. All right, and voila, I have my two pieces, my two fabric pieces for block 23. And then the next step, I'm going to show you how to pin these and sew them together. All right, so now we've got our fabric for our test block cut out. Now we can move on to part 2, which is pinning and sewing. So this is a test block. Don't worry, you got this. All right, so our first step when we're sewing any curves is we want to find the center point for each of these pieces. So your first step here is to fold them in half and just finger press or press a center line here. Just lightly press. So fold those in half like this. And just lightly press to give yourself a center line. There we go. And so now for each of these pieces, we can see that there is a center line we can match up. All right, so anytime you are piecing with curves, you want to put the concave part on top. So we're going to put these right sides together, and the first thing we're going to line up is that center line we just pressed. So line up that center line and then add your first pin. All right, so first pin is in. Our next step is we want to line up the matching points. And the matching points, just as a refresher, on your cutting templates, there are matching points on both. They're little stars. So those are the points we are going to match up. Now, if you're experienced with curves, then you probably don't need to transfer those matching points to your fabric. But if you're brand new, you might want to transfer those marks to your fabric so you can line them up in this step here. So you can see I've got a little dot here and a little dot on the back. We're going to line those up. And we're going to add a pin once we got them lined up. And, mark it for your test block. You might not find that you need it, but for your test block, just try it and see. Then line up the matching points on the other side and then add a pin. All right, and so we've got 3 pins, and the next step, we are going to add as many pins as we need to so that we ease these 2 curves into each other. So at this point, I am using my thumbs to kind of stretch this bias edge a little bit and line up. So I'm going to put a pin halfway between my first pin and my second pin here. And what I want to do is I want to add as many pins as I need to so that my fabric won't fold up as it's going through the sewing machine. All right, so I've got a pin here, a pin here, and a pin here. I'm going to add another pin halfway in between and add another pin here. Okay, so I've got 1 half pinned, and I'm going to repeat the process on the other side. Now, normally I don't like to pin, but whenever I'm sewing curves, I like to pin a lot. All right, so same idea over here. I'm using my thumbs and kind of stretching and easing that fabric together. And then I'm going to add pins halfway and just repeat the process till I'm comfortable that I'm not going to get any folds and puckers. And remember, this is just a test block, so we're just feeling this out. Okay, so at this point, I have got my curve all nice and pinned. I use 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 pins for just this little 6-inch block. All right, so I've got it pinned. Our next step is to take this to the sewing machine. Okay, so at this point, as you take your pinned unit to your sewing machine, I am going to recommend that you use some sort of stiletto tool or a paintbrush or a pen or pencil, anything you can use to help guide that unit through the machine that's not your fingertip. Taking this to our sewing machine, you'll also notice that I am sewing with a scant 1/4-inch foot. You want to be doing the same. So put it underneath your machine foot down, needle down. And then we're going to sew. And as you're sewing, the key here is you want to sew. And if you see any wrinkles or puckers coming, you want to stop and correct those puckers. All right, so here we go. We're going to sew slowly. And I'm going to bring this, I'm going to follow. And I see maybe a little pucker here, so I'm just going to stop and smooth this out right here. And I'm sewing pretty slowly that I don't need to take my pins out as I'm coming to them. I'm going to make this little pucker here. So the reason you want to sew with your needle down is you might have to stop sewing. Take your foot off the pedal and just correct a pucker here and there. Okay, remember this is a test block, so we're just getting a feel for the technique, and we're going to see how careful we actually need to be. All right, next step, we're going to move on to pressing. So take out all the pins, and then on your pressing mat, you are going to press towards the outer part of the triangle. So first step, we are going to press to set the seam. And as I'm pressing, I'm just taking care not to iron in any of the potential puckers. And then I'm going to finger press. All right, and same as always, as you're pressing, you want to make sure you're pressing and not ironing to avoid stretching any of those bias edges here. All right, and I did a pretty good job. I don't have any puckers. I do get puckers from time to time, and it's been a while since I've sewn curves. All right, so this is part 2. We have pinned and sewn our triangle, and now we have one more step to complete our triangle. All right, moving on to our last step, step 3 to complete our block 23 is we are going to trim our block 23 down to the correct size using a trimming template. I've just placed my trimming template on top of the block I just made, and you can see that the block I just made is a little bit larger than the trimming template, and that's on purpose. So my thinking here was with this curved block, while we piece this, we might get some variation in the edges with these bias edges here. We might have some warping along either side, either this side, or this side. Maybe our scant 1/4-inch seam allowance on our foot, maybe it wasn't quite correct. So I wanted to avoid making a triangle that was too small. So the idea here was to make a block and then to give us some margin of error and to trim the larger block down to the correct size using a trimming template. And hopefully that's going to take some of the stress out of piecing this curved block, because we know that whatever happens, we can come back with our trimming template and clean it up and have a perfectly sized triangle, right? So in this step, we're going to trim this excess fabric away using our trimming templates. And before I show you the demo, I just want to mention that there's a handful of different ways you can make your trimming template. You can make it out of plain copy paper. like this one here. You can make a trimming template out of quilter's plastic, like here. This is one of my older trimming templates. This one's a little bit larger. This is my 8-inch triangle trimming template here. So that's a possibility. What I'm going to recommend is that you make your trimming template out of freezer paper. And I am going to show you how you can use a trimming template using freezer paper. So I'm going to recommend it because one, I think it's the best way, and two, it's what I'm showing you how to do. All right, so before I get started with this part of the demo, let me just run through what is on my table. So of course, I've got my trimming templates that I'm going to use. I've got the block that I'm going to use here. I've got the one I just made, and then I've got a couple of actual white blocks that are for my actual Aurora. I've got my pressing mat with my iron. This is going to help stick the freezer paper template to my block. And then, of course, I've got my cutting materials. I've got my cutting board, I've got my rotary cutter, and I've got a couple different rulers to show you as I walk through this demo. All right, cool. Okay, let's get started with the first part. All right, so lay your newly completed block 23 on your ironing mat here. Let's have it pretty side up. You are going to lay your trimming template on your block. And if you're using freezer paper, the freezer paper is a little bit translucent, so you'll be able to see through and line up this curve with the fabric curve. So line that up as best you can, and then you want to make sure you have at least 1/4 inch on all sides. So you'll notice that my trimming template does not have seam allowances on my trimming template. So I need to be extra careful to make sure that I'm adding in a 1/4 inch seam allowance here. Now, if you decide that you want your trimming template to have the seams built in, then you're just going to line up your trimming template, line up this arc, and go from there. All right, so using my freezer paper trimming template, I'm going to line up the arc on the paper with the arc on the fabric. And once I see it's in place, double check to make sure I've got at least 1/4 inch on all sides. And then I am going to press my freezer paper onto the pretty side of my block. And so now the freezer paper is adhered to the block. And now I can just trim. And I am going to use my add 1/4 inch ruler here, and I'm just going to butt up the lip of the ruler, that little edge here, with the edge of the paper. And then I am going to carefully trim like that. And if you don't have an add 1/4 inch ruler, you can use your regular ruler. Find the 1/4 inch line on your ruler and line that up with the stitching line on your trimming template. And trim, just like that. Right, last side here, I'm going to go back to my add 1/4 inch ruler and trim. Okay, it looks like I'm going to have to clean this edge up a little bit. There we go. All right. And so now we have a perfectly sized triangle and nice clean edges and nice straight edges all around using our trimming template. All right, and if you're using freezer paper, just gently peel that away. There we go. And a beautiful block number 23. Awesome. How cute is this block? All right, in this tutorial video, I showed you how to make our newest block right triangle number 23. So once you get your first test block done and sewn, post it in the community and celebrate what you just made, because this is super, super cute. And then go ahead and get started on your batch and enjoy. And of course, when you get your batch done, we'd love to see that too. All right, thanks so much. I will see you soon. And I can't wait to see what you make with this block number 23. Bye for now.